Materials and shaders. Half-Life 2 came out in the midst of a significant shift in 3D graphics, where the industry moved from textures to materials and shaders. In Half-Life 1, every surface had a texture, essentially an image wrapped onto the polygons of the surface. But by Half-Life 2, just 5 years later, every surface had both a material and a shader. The shader was a lump of code that customized how the surface was rendered. The material defined properties for how the surface behaved physically and how it responded to gameplay features. It also held materials and shaders. Half-Life 2 came out in the midst of a significant shift in 3D graphics, where the industry moved from textures to materials and shaders. In Half-Life 1, every surface had a texture, essentially an image wrapped onto the polygons of the surface. But by Half-Life 2, just 5 years later, every surface had both a material and a shader. The shader was a lump of code that customized how the surface was rendered. The material defined properties for how the surface behaved physically and how it responded to gameplay features. It also held references to textures and other parameters for the shader to use for rendering. As a result, artists and designers had much more control over how things looked and behaved. However, this came with a trade-off. Half-Life 1 could run on a computer with only a CPU, but Half-Life 2 required a GPU because the computations needed for materials and shaders were specifically designed for GPU hardware. The refracting glass door here is a clear example of a custom shader, but every surface in the scene is actually running a shader of some kind.
Cube maps. With the addition of materials and shaders, we needed a solution for reflective surfaces like glass and steel. These surfaces had to know what to reflect, but in 2003 we couldn't do any of that rendering in real time, so we developed the cube map system for pre-computed reflections. A cube map is a set of 6 images on the inside of a cube, capturing the environment in every direction, like a panoramic photo that surrounds you on all sides. Level designers placed invisible marker entities throughout the levels, and during map compilation, we generate a cube map at each marker. Then, during gameplay, when rendering a reflective surface, we locate the nearest pre-computed cube map to create the reflection.
Maga kopogott? Azt sem tudtam, hogy van még ajtó.
Field of view. In Half-Life 1, we used a 90-degree field of view, or FOV, which was fairly standard for first-person shooters at the time. Field of view. In Half-Life 1, we used a 90-degree field of view, or FOV, which was fairly standard for first-person shooters at the time. But during Half-Life 2's development, we grew unhappy with it. With our game's focus on characters, we'd put extensive effort into detailed facial and body animations. But the 90-degree FOV just didn't allow players to get close enough to fully appreciate that detail. So we began experimenting with a tighter FOV, and ultimately landed on 75 degrees. It took some adjustment for both us and players, and it required an additional FOV for view models, which are the player's weapon, held at the bottom of the screen. Their models were originally built with 90 degrees in mind, so they looked distorted at 75. But this change succeeded in doing what we wanted, putting our characters front and center in the game. Field of view. In
Azt hittem maga zsaru.
Ő közénk tartozik.
Nézze meg őket.
Mondtam, hogy legközelebb értünk jönnek.
Ez egyszer remélem téved.
Reference maps. As our characters grew more lifelike between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2, we wanted the game world to feel equally realistic. In Half-Life 1, the limitations of first-person games often made it easier to lean on stylized or abstracted environments. But with Half-Life 2, we set out to create a setting that felt grounded in reality, which meant focusing on a lot of small details we hadn't before. One of our main steps was creating reference maps to standardize how we'd map real-world proportions into the game. These maps establish details like wall and door dimensions, doorknob heights, interior lighting, furniture scale, and the general scale of common objects. We created standardized textures for level designers, complete with scale and lighting values. The layouts would be consistent from the start. Besides setting up the physical world, these reference maps defined how the player would move through it, how high they could jump, how low they could duck, and the size of spaces like vents. Using these maps as foundation, we were able to keep our world geometry consistent and ensure realistically sized spaces across the game.
Én ezt már nem bírom tovább.
Minden rendbe fog jönni.
Mihez fogunk most kezdeni?
Kitalálunk valamit.
Missing material. Early on in developing our low-level graphics code, we realized it would be difficult to spot polygons that weren't rendering due to a missing texture. When this happened, you typically just see black where the polygon should be, which could easily go unnoticed in darker scenes. To catch this bug more reliably, we created an error texture that would be visually unmistakable and generated automatically whenever a texture failed to load. This gave rise to the now iconic purple and black checkerboard texture, which has since taken on a life of its own well beyond Half-Life 2.
Vigyázzon már!
The raid. The section ahead, where the Metro cops raid the apartment while the player is inside, took a lot of iteration to get right. Generally, we design Half-Life to let players set their own pace, since people move through the game in a variety of ways. Some players run, ignoring anything that doesn't seem like a threat, while others methodically poke at everything. So, whenever we need to force a specific pace, it's always a challenge to ensure players perceive that pace and naturally play along. Since this is the first time we do this, we had to put in a lot of work to make it clear to the player that they needed to move quickly, and there's no time for exploration here.
Psst! Hey, maga! Ide!
The Raid 2. In addition to making sure the player felt the pressure to move forward, we had to ensure the raid itself was foolproof. There couldn't be any way for the player to avoid it or double back past the Metro cops. The real challenge wasn't that players would try to break the scene, but that many would panic and run in random directions once they realized they were under threat for the first time. This moment requires a delicate balance. We wanted a heart-pounding escape, the sense of real danger, but we wanted players to make it through on their first try and feel like they escaped by the skin of their teeth. To achieve this, we kept the path ahead clear and reminiscent to the one they had just taken through the previous floor. A series of carefully placed triggers controls the threats appearing ahead and behind, maintaining the pressure while still giving players enough time to stay ahead of their pursuers.
Irány a tető! Nem tétovázhatunk! Itt jönnek!
Polgári értesítés. Az ellenállás külvilági kitelepítést eredményez.
Ide be, gyorsan! Mozgás! Irány a tető!